What if the greatest danger to our world isn't hatred or ignorance, but the quiet, invisible act of stopping to think? Not the absence of intelligence, but the surrender of it. In the early 1940s, as bombs fell over Europe and silence crept through the streets of Germany, a young pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer sat in a prison cell pen in hand soul burning. He had watched his nation, his colleagues, mentors, even friends transform. Not into monsters, but into passive participants. Not evil, but compliant. Educated men quoting slogans. Churchgoers turning a blind eye. Professors echoing lies. What terrified Bonhoeffer wasn't cruelty. It was how quickly the minds of good people had been turned off, outsourced to authority, consumed by conformity, seduced by simplicity. From that darkness, he wrote one of the most chilling lines ever captured on paper. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. And what he meant goes far beyond Nazi Germany. It reaches us, now, today. We tend to think of stupidity as the opposite of intelligence, as something reserved for the uneducated, the uninformed, or the slow-witted. But what if that assumption is not only wrong, but dangerously misleading? Stupidity, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer described it, is not a deficit of IQ. It's not about mental capacity at all. It is something far more insidious. It is the abdication of thought, a voluntary, often unconscious surrender of one's responsibility to think, question, and discern. It happens not in the mind, but in the soul. Imagine a scientist with multiple degrees now sharing conspiracy theories online, a teacher endorsing authoritarian ideologies, a parent refusing to believe basic medical science. These are not cartoon villains or backwoods extremists. They are ordinary people, sometimes brilliant people, who have slipped into something Bonhoeffer called functional stupidity, a state where intelligence remains intact, but the will to use it has atrophied. This is what makes it so terrifying, because it hides behind credentials. It cloaks itself in good intentions. It speaks in the voice of common sense, and in doing so, it becomes immune to evidence, logic, and even conscience. Bonhoeffer noticed that when people stop thinking critically, they don't just become passive. They become complicit. They become vectors through which harmful ideas spread not out of malice, but out of mental surrender. And that surrender can come from anywhere. Fear, fatigue, social pressure, a desire to belong. It's easy to point fingers at stupid people until we realize the real danger is how easily we all can become them. Not because we lack the capacity to think, but because we stop making the effort. Stupidity in Bonhoeffer's definition is not a failure of intellect, it's a failure of courage. And in that light, we're all vulnerable. In a world obsessed with fighting evil, we often miss the subtler, more destructive force operating silently in its shadow stupidity. Not the harmless kind that forgets where the car keys are, but the kind Bonhoeffer feared most. The kind that masquerades as goodness, speaks in moral language, and believes it's on the right side of history while blindly walking the world into darkness. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not just a theologian. He was a man who watched an entire civilization, his own, unravel before his eyes. What shocked him wasn't just the violence or the political extremism, it was the participation of good people. Professors, priests, judges, doctors, not because they hated, but because they stopped thinking. They traded reflection for repetition. They began echoing slogans instead of questioning narratives. And once that threshold was crossed, evil no longer needed to hide. It had allies who genuinely believed they were doing good. Bonhoeffer's warning was chilling in its clarity. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protest nor force can touch it. Reasoning is useless. Why? Because evil at some level knows it's evil. It wrestles with guilt. It can be resisted, exposed, overthrown. But stupidity, true, willful, moral stupidity, has no self-awareness. It feels righteous. It calls itself truth. It wears the face of virtue while unknowingly protecting the machinery of cruelty. This was Bonhoeffer's most unsettling revelation, that stupidity wasn't merely an individual flaw, it was a social contagion weaponized by those in power. And the scariest part, you can't argue with it. You can't reason with it, because it doesn't even know that it's asleep. He saw firsthand how a nation didn't descend into madness through malice, but through mental surrender. And it left him asking a question more urgent now than ever. What happens when millions stop thinking at once and believe that's what goodness looks like? In 1961, nearly 2 decades after Bonhoeffer's execution, a man named Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most disturbing psychological experiments of the 20th century. At Yale University, he recruited ordinary people teachers, accountants, postal workers to participate in what they believed was a study on learning and memory. What they didn't realize was that the real subject wasn't the learner, it was them. Participants were told to administer increasingly severe electric shocks to another person every time they answered a question incorrectly. With each mistake, the voltage increased. Behind a curtain, the learner and actor would begin to cry out in pain, scream, even beg for the experiment to stop. And yet, under the calm, authoritative voice of the experimenter urging, "Please continue," an astonishing 65% of people delivered what they believed were potentially fatal shocks. These weren't monsters. They weren't sadists. They were normal people, many of whom trembled, sweated, hesitated, yet still obeyed. What this revealed was staggering. Most individuals under perceived authority will abandon their own moral compass, not because they want to cause harm, but because they've outsourced their thinking to someone else. They choose obedience over conscience, comfort over confrontation. They trade the burden of moral responsibility for the illusion of safety and order. This is exactly what Bonhoeffer witnessed in Nazi Germany and what he feared most. He didn't just see evil men at work. He saw systems that trained people to stop thinking, to follow orders, to trust authority without question. Systems that replaced reflection with procedure and guilt with protocol. Milgram's experiment was a mirror, a horrifying confirmation that Bonhoeffer had been right all along. Human beings, when faced with pressure and hierarchy, often don't need to be convinced to do harm. They just need to stop questioning. And in that moment, stupidity doesn't look like ignorance, it looks like obedience. The most dangerous evil, it seems, isn't born from hate. It's born when good people decide not to think. When we think of stupidity, we often picture an individual flaw, someone who failed to pay attention in school, who makes poor decisions, who simply doesn't get it. But Bonhoeffer shattered this narrow view. He saw stupidity not just as a personal shortcoming, but as a social phenomenon, a force that amplifies in groups, institutions, and collective movements. In his prison writings, Bonhoeffer observed that people who were intelligent and reasonable in private could become frighteningly irrational in crowds. He wrote, "It becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one." In other words, stupidity flourishes not because people lack intelligence, but because they are immersed in environments where thinking independently is discouraged or punished. Modern psychology would later confirm what Bonhoeffer had already seen with haunting clarity. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch conducted a now famous experiment on conformity. Participants were asked to compare line lengths, a simple task. But when placed in a group where everyone else deliberately gave the wrong answer, 75% of individuals went along with the crowd at least once, even though their eyes told them the truth. Why? Because the human brain is wired for belonging. The fear of isolation can override even the most basic logic. We don't want to be the one who raises their hand and says, "This doesn't make sense." We want to be safe, accepted, aligned. This is the breeding ground of functional stupidity group settings, where doubt is taboo, where slogans replace substance, and where emotional certainty outweighs intellectual honesty. In such environments, truth becomes negotiable and conscience becomes a liability. And today, those environments aren't just physical, they're digital. Social media has created echo chambers where deviation is punished, complexity is mocked, and everyone is subtly taught, think like us or don't think at all. Bonhoeffer's warning echoes louder now than ever. Stupidity, when socially reinforced, becomes more contagious than truth and far more comfortable. The real danger isn't the isolated fool, it's the entire room of people nodding in agreement, too afraid or too weary to ask. But is this actually right? Functional stupidity doesn't emerge in a vacuum, it's cultivated. And today it's not just tolerated, it's rewarded. The very systems we depend on, economic, digital, political, are quietly training us to think less, react faster, and feel certain rather than curious. In this world, intellectual shortcuts aren't a failure, they're a survival strategy. Think about it. Our economic system demands constant hustle. Many Americans are working multiple jobs, overwhelmed with debt, flooded with notifications, drowning in endless decisions. In that state of chronic stress, who has time to dive into nuance? Who can afford the luxury of deep thought? Economists call it rational ignorance, a choice made out of necessity to remain uninformed, because learning is simply too costly in terms of time and energy. It makes sense on the individual level, but collectively it leads to a society that becomes easier to manipulate, a society that runs not on knowledge but on convenience. Social media amplifies this effect. Platforms are engineered to prioritize what provokes, not what educates. Outrage gets more clicks than accuracy. Simplicity spreads faster than substance. The result, a digital culture that monetizes our worst impulses and punishes thoughtful hesitation. News outlets competing for attention reduce complex issues to viral headlines. Politicians condense multi-layered realities into bumper sticker slogans. The algorithm doesn't care if it's true, it only cares if it spreads. Bonhoeffer didn't live to see this digital age, but his insight was prophetic. He warned of systems that make honest thinking prohibitively difficult. And here we are in a world where speed beats truth, certainty beats reflection, and emotion beats analysis. It's not that people don't want to think. It's that everything around them, every system they're part of, makes not thinking the easier, more rewarding option. And that's not just dangerous. That's how civilizations forget how to think altogether. It's tempting to think that stupidity spreads by accident. That misinformation goes viral because people are careless. But what if the truth is far more unsettling? What if stupidity is being engineered, deliberately designed into the architecture of the platforms we use every day? Bonhoeffer saw propaganda spread through newspapers and radios. But we live in a digital era where algorithms have replaced megaphones and manipulation no longer needs to shout it, whispers through our feeds. The most dangerous echo chambers aren't built in war rooms. They're coded into platforms that tailor your reality based on what keeps you emotionally engaged. Not what's true, not what's nuanced, just what works. A 2018 study from MIT revealed that false information spreads 6 times faster than the truth on social media. Why? Because lies are crafted for emotional impact. They confirm what we want to believe. They simplify what we don't want to understand. And the algorithm rewards them. Every time you like, comment, share, or even pause, your behavior is logged and interpreted. The machine learns this is what keeps you hooked. And so it feeds you more of the same. More anger, more certainty, more confirmation, until your world becomes a closed loop and echo chamber, where truth becomes irrelevant and doubt is treated as disloyalty. This is how functional stupidity thrives in the 21st century, not in the absence of information, but in the abundance of carefully filtered, emotionally satisfying half-truths. And most of the time, you don't even realize it's happening. Have you ever noticed that your feed always seems to agree with you? That what you see online feels like the obvious truth, while those who disagree seem irrational, dangerous, or even evil? That's not a coincidence. That's precision-engineered ignorance. Bonhoeffer warned that stupidity becomes dangerous when it's untouchable by reason. Today, it's not only untouchable, it's profitable. And in that profit-driven machine, your mind isn't being liberated. It's being shaped one satisfying lie at a time. We like to believe that intelligence protects us, that education, credentials, and good intentions serve as armor against moral failure. But history tells a far darker story. Again and again, in moments of collective crisis, it isn't the uneducated who pose the greatest risk. It's the educated who stop thinking critically. The Salem Witch Trials weren't conducted by malicious monsters, but by church elders, civic leaders, and upright citizens who believed they were protecting their communities. The Red Scare of the 1950s wasn't fueled by fringe conspiracy theorists. It was championed by senators, journalists, and school teachers who believed they were defending democracy. In both cases, intelligent, socially respected individuals chose safety over scrutiny, groupthink over integrity, and fear over truth. What Bonhoeffer recognized in Nazi Germany was this same tragic pattern. Professors who had once taught ethics began endorsing fascism. Pastors who had preached compassion began justifying persecution. These were not ignorant men, they were deeply educated. But they were also deeply afraid. And in that fear, they surrendered their minds. What makes this so chilling is not just the betrayal of intellect, it's how natural it feels in the moment. When your neighbor's not in agreement, when the media echoes your beliefs, when questioning the status quo makes you a target, it becomes easier to comply than confront. Thinking becomes risky. Silence becomes survival. And in that silence, stupidity grows. We often imagine that if we had lived through those times, we would have spoken up, stood firm, asked questions. But Bonhoeffer's life and death stand as a haunting counterpoint. He did ask questions. He did speak up. And he paid for it with his life. The danger then is not that we might become evil. It's that we might become quiet, comfortable, well-meaning, and complicit. Not because we intended harm, but because we stopped noticing it. And history, it turns out, has never needed monsters. It just needs good people who've stopped thinking. In a society that celebrates convenience, conformity, and quick answers, independent thinking has become not only rare, but costly. Dietrich Bonhoeffer knew this better than anyone. He called it costly grace, the ability to hold on to your moral compass even when it brings discomfort, danger, or isolation. Bonhoeffer didn't just theorize about this, he lived it. As the Nazi regime rose to power, he spoke out while others stayed silent. He refused to preach what the state dictated. He joined a resistance movement that plotted against Hitler. And for that, he was imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately executed just weeks before the war ended. He chose truth over safety, and he paid with his life. But Bonhoeffer never begged for sympathy. He believed that grace was never meant to be easy, and that genuine moral courage would always demand something from us. It was never about heroism for its own sake. It was about remaining human in a world trying to dehumanize you. Today, we may not face physical persecution for speaking our minds, but the pressure to conform is no less real. Choosing to think independently can cost us relationships, reputations, careers. It's easier to echo the dominant narrative, to repost what aligns with our beliefs, to stay inside the warm echo chamber where no one challenges us. But that ease comes at a price. Every time we avoid asking hard questions, every time we choose certainty over inquiry, every time we exchange complexity for comfort, we chip away at our intellectual integrity. Bit by bit, post by post, silence by silence. Bonhoeffer's legacy reminds us that independent thought is not an intellectual luxury, it is a moral obligation. Not because it's safe, but because it's right. And in a world that rewards obedience, choosing to think clearly and bravely is no small act. It is in itself a quiet form of resistance, a costly grace. If functional stupidity is a kind of surrender of responsibility, of discernment, of awareness, then resisting it requires something both simple and profoundly difficult. The daily, deliberate act of choosing to stay mentally awake. It's not about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the most willing to question, reflect, and remain intellectually honest, especially when it's uncomfortable. Bonhoeffer believed that true resistance begins with what he called costly grace, but in practical terms, that means developing small, consistent habits that keep your mind alive in a culture that profits from your passivity. The first habit is practicing intellectual humility, the courageous admission that you do not know everything and that what you believe might be wrong. In a society obsessed with being right, saying "I don't know" is radical. It opens the door to learning. It invites dialogue. It makes space for truth. Second, engage in intellectual friction. Once a week, read or listen to a thoughtful argument that challenges your worldview. Not to change your mind instantly, but to test the strength of your beliefs. If your ideas can't withstand opposing evidence, maybe they weren't as solid as you thought. Third, embrace what psychologists call productive ignorance. When you feel absolutely certain about something, ask yourself, what evidence would make me reconsider? If you can't think of any, it's a warning sign not of conviction, but of dogma. Fourth, slow down your sharing. Before you repost an article, a video, or a statistic, take 60 seconds to verify it from an independent, nonpartisan source. That brief pause may seem small, but it interrupts the viral machinery that fuels functional stupidity. And finally, normalize saying "I was wrong." In a culture that equates error with weakness, admitting a mistake is one of the strongest things you can do. These are not grand acts of rebellion. They're daily disciplines, small sacred choices to remain mentally sovereign. Because the real resistance begins not in protest but in thought, in refusing to hand over your mind to anyone who hasn't earned it. While personal responsibility is essential, Bonhoeffer understood that individual effort alone is not enough. We cannot meditate our way out of a broken system. If stupidity is partly systemic, if it's rewarded, normalized, and even incentivized, then resistance must also include changing the very structures that shape how people think. We live in a world where information flows faster than ever, but comprehension is stifled, where digital platforms determine what we see, and we rarely question how or why. Bonhoeffer warned of systems that made genuine reflection prohibitively difficult. Today, that warning has become reality. We need algorithmic transparency. Social media platforms should be required to disclose how content is curated and what biases are embedded in their systems. Right now, billions of people are being psychologically shaped by code they never see and never understand. That's not freedom. That's subtle, high-tech manipulation. We also need national media literacy campaigns, not optional, not niche. Public education must prioritize teaching people how to evaluate sources, verify facts, and detect manipulation. In an age of deepfakes and AI-generated misinformation, critical thinking isn't just a skill, it's survival. Moreover, we must rethink how platforms reward content. Imagine an online world where thoughtful nuance was favored over clickbait, where asking honest questions ranked higher than shouting confident answers. That's not a fantasy, it's a design choice. And it's one we need to demand. But perhaps most critically, we need economic structures that give people the mental space to think. When you're worried about rent, food, healthcare, when your life is a constant survival mode, there's no room for philosophy. Stress narrows thinking. Poverty shrinks awareness. Exhaustion kills reflection. This is not just a digital problem, it's a societal one. Bonhoeffer didn't blame individuals for losing their minds under pressure. He blamed the forces that made surrender feel necessary. If we want a thinking population, we must build a world where thinking isn't a luxury, it's a possibility. Because human dignity doesn't just depend on having the right to speak. It depends on having the capacity to understand. When Dietrich Bonhoeffer warned that against the stupidity we are defenseless, he could not have imagined the digital age. He had only newspapers, radios, and speeches to contend with. But even then, he saw how easily a society could surrender its intellect to repetition, fear, and the seductive comfort of conformity. Now imagine what he would say today. We're no longer battling state propaganda printed on pages. We're facing an entirely new kind of threat, a digital ecosystem that uses artificial intelligence to study our thoughts, exploit our emotions, and predict our behavior with surgical precision. Every click, every pause, every swipe is recorded and analyzed, not to understand us, but to manipulate us. This is not conspiracy, it's design, and it's devastatingly effective. We've moved from propaganda to algorithmic conditioning, from manipulated truth to fabricated reality. Deepfakes can now create entirely convincing videos of events that never happened. AI can write news stories, generate images, even mimic voices of authority. The question is no longer, can you trust what you read? It's, can you trust what you see, what you hear, what you think you know? And here's the most chilling part. The human brain is still wired for a world that no longer exists. We evolved to trust familiarity, to rely on emotion, to cling to certainty when we feel threatened. These instincts helped our ancestors survive, but now they make us dangerously vulnerable. In this new landscape, functional stupidity isn't just a personal risk, it's a global vulnerability. A population that cannot discern truth from illusion is a population that can be led anywhere without question, without resistance. Bonhoeffer feared the surrender of thought. Today, we must fear the outsourcing of thought to systems that do not think, feel, or care. The battlefield is no longer only ethical, it is neurological. And the real danger is not that we will be lied to. It's that we will be too overwhelmed to care. At the core of Bonhoeffer's warning lies a truth that cuts deeper than politics, deeper than history, and deeper than technology. It is this: when people stop thinking independently, they stop being fully human. The act of critical thought, of pausing, reflecting, questioning, is not just an intellectual process. It's a spiritual one. It is the breath of human dignity. Without it, we become echoes of whatever voice is loudest followers, of whatever trend is fastest pawns, and whatever system is strongest. Bonhoeffer saw it firsthand. He watched as an entire society, educated, cultured, deeply religious, surrendered, not just their morality, but their mind. Not all at once, but gradually, painfully, willingly. And yet, even as he sat in a prison cell facing execution, he refused to let go of that most fragile and powerful human act, the ability to think for oneself. His final words: "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life weren't just defiance. They were testimony, proof that the human spirit remains unbroken even in the face of death, as long as it refuses to be intellectually enslaved." That's what makes his challenge so piercing today. He never asked who is smart, he asked who stands fast. When the pressure to conform is overwhelming, when speaking out makes you a target, when silence is rewarded and truth is punished, who still thinks not out of arrogance, but out of courage, not to rebel, but to remain human. Because in the age of curated reality and algorithmic thought, the most radical thing you can do is simply pause and ask, is this true? That moment of hesitation, that spark of self-awareness is the difference between being a citizen and being a puppet. And it doesn't require a revolution. It requires a choice to think, even when it hurts, even when it costs, even when no one else is doing it. That is the courage Bonhoeffer died for. And it may be the courage the future depends on. In a world overloaded with information but starving for truth, the most important habit you can develop isn't consuming more, it's thinking more deeply about less. Bonhoeffer's insight reminds us that intellectual surrender doesn't always look like stupidity. Sometimes it looks like obedience, like politeness, like going along with the crowd to keep the peace. But when we trade critical thinking for comfort, we lose more than clarity, we lose agency. We become spectators in our own lives, outsourcing our judgment to algorithms, media narratives, political parties, or peer pressure. And that slow erosion of thought is how societies slide into silence, how lies become norms, how dignity is dismantled without a fight. The lesson is urgent and personal. Protect your mind like you protect your home. Don't let just anything in. Question what you believe, even if you believed it for years. Read people you disagree with, not to be persuaded, but to sharpen your clarity. Pause before you react, especially when something online makes you angry or self-righteous. That's often a sign someone or something is pulling your strings. Intellectual courage doesn't mean having all the answers. It means being brave enough to ask the right questions, especially when it's easier not to. That's not just how we stay informed. It's how we stay free.